In the often mystical process of discovery, a few innovations arise solely from original thinking, flying in the face of convention and challenging the status quo. Einstein's special theory of relativity, advanced in 1905, languished for nearly 2 decades until the physics mainstream finally caught up. Many inventions stem from a hybrid case whereby the originator brings a unique point of view and a set of experiences to known facts. Still, other advances can be traced ultimately to the steady march of technology. Given the state of the art, they must occur and often take root in several places at once. So it was for radar, a classic case of simultaneous invention. Within a few months of the Daventry experiment, researchers at least 6 other nations were pursuing systems with pulse transmissions, cathode ray displays, and distance, elevation, and direction finding. One country, the United States, even enjoyed several months head start on Watson Watt's crew. The emergent era drew upon more than a half-century of advances, starting with the path-breaking work of James Clerk Maxwell and Heinrich Hertz. Maxwell first unified the equations of electromagnetism, culminating in the 1873 publication of his landmark treatise on electricity and magnetism. Nearly 15 years later, Hertz brought things to reality in a classic series of experiments. The German investigator generated and detected the first known radio waves, then proceeded to show that the waves traveled with the velocity of light and fell subject to, among other things, reflection, refraction, diffraction, and polarization. In short, they exhibited all the properties of visible light, just as Maxwell had predicted. The discovery set off a race to manipulate and employ the newfound phenomenon. In 1896, young Guglielmo Marconi, his ideas unappreciated by the Italian government, moved to Britain. With the backing of the government post office, he soon established radio links nearly every 2 miles across Salisbury Plain and then over the Bristol Channel. Some 5 years later, Marconi successfully sent radio signals across the Atlantic, opening the door for a worldwide communications industry by demonstrating the practicality of long-range transmissions. The evolution of radio carried with it the ingredients necessary for radar. At first, long-distance communications were thought to depend on waves of at least 200 meters. The American Arthur Edwin Kennelly and Britain's Oliver Heaviside independently suggested that the transmissions ricocheted between the Earth and some sort of conducting surface or high-altitude boundary later called the ionosphere. That kept them from vanishing into space. Shorter waves would also bounce along this atmospheric and geological pinball machine, but were largely ignored because researchers generally believed the signals would attenuate over long distances. Before radar and the ability to detect and pinpoint the position of some object could come into play, however, much shorter wavelengths on the order of 50 meters or less were virtually necessity. Just as waves of water rippled out from their point of origin, radio signals spread over a broader area while propagating through the air. Unless transmitted pulses were tightly focused, too little of their energy would return to the receiver after traveling to a target and back. It wasn't until World War I brought the need for tightly directed transmissions secure from enemy ears that this criterion became to be satisfied. Over the course of the war, physicists and engineers at places like AT&T, Western Electric, ARM, pushed the art of wireless transmission ahead as much as a decade. Researchers soon realized that short waves did not attenuate nearly as much as previously believed. The findings suddenly made higher frequency signals much more attractive. Because short waves started out more concentrated, a greater portion of the signal actually arrived at its destination than did a long wave broadcast. That not only enabled transmissions between specific locations, it reduced power demands and relieved transmitters and receivers of a host of bothersome vagaries. In the early and middle 1920s, led by talented amateur hams, a shortwave bridge sprang up across the Atlantic. On its heels came industrial concerns, RCA, Westinghouse, and Germany's Telefunken among them. racing to establish a network of commercial shortwave radio stations. The last major piece of the puzzle fell into place in concert with the shortwave revolution. The theoretical boundary layer envisioned by Kennelly and Heaviside not only attracted immense interest from radio enthusiasts, it also drew in atmospheric researchers seeking to understand the Earth's mysteries. For more than 2 decades, scientists poked and pried at the hypothetical invisible shield, trying to prove its existence. Among those participating in the hunt were the American investigators Merle A. Tuve, then a graduate student of Johns Hopkins University, and Gregory Breet, a physicist with the Carnegie Institute's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. In July 1925, the pair sets up an experiment that measured the height of the ionosphere by sending up radio pulses rather than a continuous transmission of energy. In one purely scientific sense, the innovation came too late. About 6 months earlier, Britain's E.V. Appleton and colleague M.A.F. Barnett had used a different radio technique to prove the existence of the ionosphere and measured its height. Work that won Appleton a Nobel Prize and robbed Tuve and Bright of the same honor. But the American pulse method was quickly adopted worldwide as the simplest and most direct. It did not take long before important improvements showed up. A cathode ray tube was attached to the receiver to provide a live image of incoming echoes. Moreover, in the initial Tuve-Brett experiment, the pulses and the rest time between transmissions were roughly equal. Various researchers, however, soon added a multi-vibrator circuit to the transmitter that compressed pulses to around 1,000th of a second, separated by much longer rest intervals on the order of a few hundredths of a second. Shorter pulses helped resolve nearby targets since transmissions was less likely to be in progress when the echo arrived, while the extended rest interval provided time for the signal to travel farther and reveal the presence of more distant objects. Although both the pulse transmission method and the short waves necessary for radar existed in the mid-20s, it took at least 5 years for the pieces to coalesce. Industry had to gear up to mass produce the components, and researchers needed to put them to use. The awakening was spurred by the immense consumer market for home and car radios that opened in the late 20s, a surge that brought with it the triode, a much improved transmitting and receiving tube. A few years later, the infant television industry, led by such pioneers as RCA and Marconi Company, and the British giant electrical and musical industries, contributed crucial refinements in the cathode ray tube, transforming it from an obscure laboratory to a compact, lightweight device of widespread utility. As the 30s got underway, radio waves permeated the air. It became simply a matter of time before someone or several people hit on the idea of radar. In the nascent years of radio, a few had come close. As far back as 1904, an obscure Dusseldorf engineer named Christian Holzmeier filed patents in Germany and Britain for the Telemobile Scope, a collision prevention device for ships that worked much like a searchlight, only with radio waves in place of visible rays, and even possessed a crude rangefinder. Nearly 2 decades later, in September 1922, the wooden steamer Dorchester plied up the Potomac River and passed between a transmitter and receiver being used for experimental U.S. Navy high-frequency radio communications. The 2 researchers conducting the test, Albert Hoyt Taylor and Leo C. Young, had sailed on ships and knew of the difficulty in guarding against enemy vessels seeking to penetrate harbors and fleet formations under darkness. Quickly putting the serendipitous findings together, the men proposed using radios. propose using radio waves like burglar alarm, stringing up the electromagnetic curtain across harbor entrances and between ships, but receiving no response to the suggestion and with many demands on their time. The investigators let the idea wither on the vine. By the time Watson Watt set out to investigate the death ray idea in 1935, the technological landscape for radar had been prepared. The early 30s brought a spate of reports of radio signals being interfered with by planes, ships, and even cars. The government post office report Wilkins mentioned to Watson Watt served just one example. From there, it was not a great leap, as Taylor and Young's 1922 report made clear, to envisioning the immense defense implications of a novel technology. In the mid-1930s, numerous radar-like inventions began appearing before patent examiners, though most lacked some key element. The pulse system, money, or just the time to pursue a still dubious venture. Ironically, the first system to incorporate the pulses synonymous with the modern radar was cobbled together in late 1934 by Robert Morris Page, working under the direction of Albert Taylor and Leo Young at the Naval Research Laboratory at Anacostia in the District of Columbia. Taylor and Young had resuscitated their original suggestion a few years earlier after high-frequency radio signals began being interrupted by aircraft. The low-priority radio detection project had struggled through the Great Depression. Until early in 1934, Young convinced his boss, Taylor, to give pulses a try. At Taylor's direction, Robert Page built the first makeshift system for following December, transmitter in one building and receiver in another, both linked to rooftop antennas. As a small plane flew up and down the Potomac through the transmitter beam, the outgoing signal so saturated the receiver that an echo could only be detected through the wavering or beating of the mass of clutter. And nothing was seen at all unless the target passed close enough that a visual sighting would have served much better. Nevertheless, the test proved that the feasibility of a pulse system a full month before Robert Alexander Watson Watt even dreamed of radar. This was only the tip of the iceberg. In March 1934, the same time Page got started building his pulse set, a primitive continuous wave radar detected echoes from the German warship Hessen in Kiel Harbor. Back in Italy a bit earlier, while testing a telephone link between Vatican City and the Pope's summer retreat, at Castel Gandolfo, Guglielmo Marconi had noticed a rhythmic disturbance in his test signal that turned out to be caused by a moving steamroller. This had sparked the inventor's interest in radar and led to his lab manufacturing prototype sets for the Italian army by August 1935. By the same watershed year, the Leningrad Electrophysicists Institute had fashioned its own crude radar system that detected airplanes nearly 2 miles off. The newly built French liner Normandy carried on its deck a microwave obstacle detector, and inklings of radar could be found in Japan and Holland. Like the British work, most of these projects took nourishment from military exigencies and existed under a veil of secrecy. What set Watson Watt's effort apart from its unknown competitors was largely the scope of the vision, a defensive network accepted in principle at the highest governmental levels and backed by a leading member of the military. Moreover, none of the rival endeavors exhibited the British urgency, the most advanced in Germany and the United States, potentially the greatest military powers on earth, simply found no strong reason to push ahead. Hitler's military command, already thinking of Panzer blitzes and Luftwaffe thunder strikes, did not see the pressing need for seemingly defensive weapon. America, separated by vast seas from its potential enemies and swept with a isolationist fervor, could not yet be bothered to stir from its slumber. The seafarers' village of Orford glistened like a slightly dusty jewel on the dank Suffolk coast, about 90 miles northeast of London. A Norman keep, an outpost to guard against marauders from the sea, looks over a broad expanse of windswept flatlands from a knoll on the town's southern edge. The village itself, with a handful of shops and pubs, stretches for a few hundred yards along a single main road that slips down to the River Aldi, the fishermen's conduit to the North Sea hunting grounds. 100 yards or so across the fast-flowing river lies a desolate 15-mile-long spit of salt marsh and shingle called Orfordness. Often considered an island but thinly connected to the mainland several miles upriver, the narrow isthmus runs along the coast, parallel to both river and sea, well after the Aldi emerges into the River Ore a few hundred yards beyond the village. Orfordness hosts a treeless, windswept landscape crisscrossed by dikes and scattered pea bush. Watson Watt considered the island far from the public eye, an ideal spot to set up his infant radar program in the cold, wet spring of 1935. Eddie Bowen motored into Orford as part of a small convoy, 6 people, 2 cars, and 2 Royal Air Force lorries loaded with equipment. The evening of May 13. Hail and sleet greeted the entourage as it assembled on the quay the next morning. During World War I, the island had become home to an airfield on one end and a bombing range on the other. Gunnery practice kept up sporadically into the early 1930s. But by the time Bowen's group arrived, Orfordness lay largely derelict. A government-contracted motorcraft, driven by a taciturn boatman, carried the men across. On the opposite shore, another close-mouthed local operated a strange vehicle built on the combined chassis of a Ford Model T and an ancient fire truck. This contraception carted men and equipped across the empty aerodrome to a confluence of wooden huts. The buildings had recently been repaired and power cables laid to the village, but notices from the station adjutant going back to 1918 still clung to the walls, and the site never lost its abandoned feeling. It was a desolate, forbidding place whose only redeeming features were birds, an early worker recalled. A dusty, unopened wine bottle was found tucked on a chimney ledge in one of the buildings. Only 4 members of the entourage would be staying. Skip Wilkins fell naturally into the role of leader. Shy and modest, he had a penchant for inventing nicknames and proved himself a shrewd judge of character. Then there was Bowen, who would emerge as Wilkins' right hand. Rounding out the crew were L.H. Bainbridge Bell, a highly talented but moody circuit designer, and his technical assistant, George Willis. Bowen had been cast into this group by one of those early twists of fate that shaped the course of a lifetime. After earning an honors degree at University College in his South Wales hometown of Swansea, he had undertaken the pilgrimage to King's College in London to study the renowned Appleton. While pursuing his doctorate, the Welshman had often journeyed to Watson Watt's Radio Research Center in Slough to utilize its facilities, coming under what he termed the superintendent's benign influence. When Bowen completed his PhD and went job hunting, the enthusiastic Scot asked him to apply to a secret project just underway. This turned out to be radar. Watson Watt's top assistant, Jimmy Hurd, briefed Bowen on the endeavor one day in April, stressing that the work fell under the Official Secrets Act and reading with gusto the penalty for leaking information. Hanged by the neck until life is extinct. At Orfordness, just a few weeks after that sobering indoctrination It fell chiefly to Bowen to develop the transmitter, while his comrades concentrating on getting the receiver and the cathode ray indicator up to snuff. Orford Nest contained no proper workshop and few tools. Nevertheless, the team plunged ahead, starting work at 8:30 each morning and frequently staying past ferry hours. The men either rowed themselves back to the village or slept in one of the huts. Many were the nights I spent on a camp bed alongside the transmitter, with a piece of cake and a bottle of beer for supper, and as likely as not, the same for breakfast. Bowen later recalled. Watson Watt soon after arrived to hold the first of what became ritualistic discussions at the Crown and Castle Hotel, an inn and tavern across a small gully from the picturesque keep. In those early days, the Scotsmen visited almost every weekend to check on progress and plot the future over drinks in the hotel's comfortable lounge. Despite the often dire Suffolk weather, Bowen counted the days at Orford Nest as among the happiest of his life. He lived with an attentive spinster and kept tabs on gossip at the Jolly Sailor, a pub just up the street from the quay. He delighted in the colorful village where one man served as hairdresser, barber, insurance agent, and secretary-treasurer of both the soccer and cricket clubs. The work also proved satisfying, though still lacking tools and finely engineered components. Bowen quickly succeeded in stringing together a hodgepodge of scrounged parts, including two metal cans, one fitted inside the other, and served as a condenser into what he called a marvel of crudity. Within just a few weeks, he had boosted transmitter power to respectable 75 kilowatts. On the other side of the fence, Wilkins and Bainbridge Bell coaxed the receiver along, feeding its signals into a cathode ray oscilloscope that automatically showed range along a horizontal scale. Behind these improvements, the station sprang to life. Two 75-foot lattice towers rose alongside Bowen's hut, transmitting antenna wires strung between them. A stone's throw away 4 more towers, cornerstones of a rectangle about 30 meters wide and 100 meters long, formed the receiving course. 2 separate sets of aerials were strung in parallel between towers on the short sides of the configuration. The entire system was up and working by mid-June in time for the station's grand opening. Tizard committee members ventured over from London for the occasion. They didn't expect a live demonstration, but the ever-optimistic Watson Watt promised one anyway. Prospects for an impressive showing did look good. While warming up the system the day before the big event, the Islanders, as the townfolk began calling the radar men, followed a Singapore flying boat cruising off Orford Nest out to about 15 miles and back. However, on the official test day, Saturday, June 15th, their luck did not hold. Amidst a thunderstorm and heavy ionospheric clutter, a Valencia biplane lumbered through the antenna beam, but only the Scot claimed to see a slight flicker on the screen. Early the next morning, the old troop transport roared aloft for a second go-round. This time, no one saw a thing. The setbacks did not seem to perturb the visitors, who expressed satisfaction with progress to date. Still, Watson Watt stayed on after the committee departed to investigate the failure. On the Monday, with no modifications to set, a tiny group unexpectedly picked up a magnificently strong signal, a twin-engined Scapa flying boat practicing bombing runs at sea. Came in clearly on the range scope at 17 miles. The Islanders tracked it up and down the coast, as far out as 29 miles, or 46 kilometers. We were all wildly excited, Bowen recounted. Watson Watt telephoned the airfield at nearby Felixstowe, imploring the commanding officer to send the plane up again on the same flight path. After that thing sailed along for a while. In late July, the group passed another milestone. watching an echo with an unusually shaped amplitude. Wilkins correctly guessed that the strange blip held not one, but 3 planes, hinting at a time when the fighters not only reacted to a threat, but deployed according to the magnitude of the impending attack. The group pressed on throughout the summer. Clearing technical obstacles, pulse time was compressed, and the signal's rest interval stretched to improve sensitivity and range and draw a bead on their working goal of locating planes at least 50 miles out. The researchers steadily drove down the operating wavelength first to 26 meters and then to 13 meters to avoid interference from commercial signals, ultimately to counter deliberate jamming. The system would operate on 4 interchangeable wavelengths between 10 meters and 13 meters. Steering fighter pilots close enough to see enemy planes posed a far more difficult challenge than extending range. The radar system had to determine an aircraft's height and direction, or azimuth. Repeated measurements of range and azimuth would reveal the enemy's heading. Early on, Wilkins solved the height-finding problem by adapting a method he had developed at SLO for measuring the downcoming angle of transatlantic telephone communications. The technique involved comparing signals received at 2 parallel horizontal antennas in order to find the elevation angle of the incoming echo. However, before the war, this system was modified to employ a pair of aerials set at different heights. A comparison of signal phase determined the target's angle of elevation. Shortly after clearing the initial height-finding hurdle, Watson Watt announced a solution to the formidable direction-finding problem. Originally, the group intended to rely on simple triangulation, using 2 or more stations to locate a target. But the nightmare involved in trying to track several planes at once, a real-life necessity, forced them to abandon the plan. The Scotsman's idea hinged on placing 2 sets of aerials in a cross-dipole configuration, one slightly above the perpendicular to the other. The non-parallel position of the 2 antennas in effect simulated 2 stations, with the goniometer sorting through the incoming signals to fix the target's azimuth. Taken as a whole, these advances catapulted the infant technology into adolescence. Within a few months, the islanders could track planes 40 miles out and gauge the height of an aircraft at 7,000 feet to within 1,000 feet, good enough for daytime interception. The men set about replacing the 75-foot aerial arrays with gigantic lattice towers about 250 feet tall. The increased height provided greater ranges, even without boosting transmitter power, another priority by allowing for better propagation over the Earth's curvature. At the same time, efforts continued to improve the receivers and expand the range of operating frequencies. By September 1935, the project had evolved so far that enthusiastic British government approved in principle the construction of a chain of 5 RDF stations, the first stage of the radio wave shield envisioned by Watson Watt. The stations would be erected at 25 miles intervals up and down the east coast from the River Tyne to Southampton, flanking the Thames estuary, gateway to the great nerve center of London, with its vast dockyards, railway hubs, and government halls. The first stations, as it turned out, aimed eastward at the Belgian port of Ostend, taking their cue from Air Ministry tactical data that admitted the possibility the Germans might occupy the French side of the English Channel. Work on the early warning chain started that fall, but it soon became apparent that the rapidly swelling RDF project required a larger staff and a more hospitable base than Orfordness. One day, probably still in early autumn, Bowen, Wilkins, and Watson Watt drove along the southern Suffolk coast in Scotsman's new Daimler on a leisurely scouting expedition to find another home. As the trio cruised over meandering two-lane roads, Wilkins mentioned seeing a sprawling estate with buildings that could serve as laboratories and living quarters just 10 miles or so south of Orford. Nearing the confluence of the River Dibben and the North Sea, located on a small bluff and with no high ground between it and the water to interfere with signals, the manor could be ideal for the radar group. Watson Watt insisted on reconnoitering the property that day. Soon Rowe and Wimperis drove out. Looking for local gossip, the duo approached the purveyor of ginger beer stall near the winding lane that led up to the coveted site. Bawdsey Manor, they learned, was a country estate built by Sir W. Cuthbert Quilter, a wealthy stockbroker and businessman. The family might be willing to sell. Encouraged, the men pressed on. By year's end, the government had approved a £24,000 outlay for the 168-acre estate. In contrast to the bleakness surrounding windswept Orfordness, Bawdsey Manor brought a dreamy quality to the business of defense. The stately structure, its Gothic front connecting two minaret-capped towers, one red brick, the other white stone, overlooked the rough-hewn coast with an air of elegant benevolence. A brisk stroll along the bluff, the walkway populated with purple emperors, painted ladies, and other exotic butterflies, found a stairway leading to the pebbly beach and the sounds and smells of the North Sea. An 8-acre lawn sprawled off the east wing, separated from the sea by dunes and a fringe of tamarisk. Although in need of some attention, the estate held all of the other accoutrements of the landed gentry. Peach trees, bougainvillea, swimming pool, orangery, lily pond, topiary, and rose garden. Wood-paneled rooms peered out over this panorama. A central dining hall contained a musician's gallery, down to the pipe organ. The Quilters left a majestic billiards room, filled by the roar of the sea. The government wanted the table removed, but the former owners offered it up for the special price of £25. Eddie Bowen paid for it out of his own pocket. The move to what became known formally as Bawdsey Research Station wasn't complete until May 1936. Labs sprang up in the White Tower and the stables. The hills behind the manor, overlooking marshland and the Deben, played host to imposing wooden receiving towers. Watson Watt, forsaking the long weekend commute, took palatial quarters overlooking the water and began scouring the nation's physics laboratories for young talent. By August, when the station formally severed its National Physical Laboratory ties and became part of the Air Ministry, the staff totaled close to 20. Since single men predominated, the superintendent ordered a bachelor's quarters established in the manor house. A few married members either lived in cottages dotting the estate or, more likely, commuted by ferry from across the River Deben in Felixstowe. The close quarters and easy camaraderie gave the place the air of college dormitory. One of the new recruits, a sharp-minded Imperial College student named Robert Hanbury Brown, arrived just 2 weeks before his 20th birthday with an oversized Dalmatian dubbed Gay Domino. Before the manor got too crowded, the pet merited a suite of its own. Working hours nominally ran from 9 to 5, but in truth the men stopped when the mood struck to enjoy a swim, keep up the gardens, or play cricket and soccer on the lawn. They made up for their time by burning the midnight oil. Technical discussions often took place in a timbered hall before a roaring fire. With the exception of Watson Watt, the entire entourage worked on a first-name basis. As fall approached, two research groups developed: the main chain home effort at Bodsey and smaller program at Orphaness, aimed chiefly at putting together the transmitter, receiver, and other components necessary to move to shorter wavelengths. Eddie Bowen's assignment fell a bit outside both efforts. After the move to Bodsey, the young physicist continued to bear chief responsibility for the transmitter. But he devoted more and more time to RDF Project 2, a radar system small enough to fit into a plane. Almost from the beginning, such an airborne interception, or AI set, was considered a vital supplement to the early warning network. The chain typically could fix the aircraft within a mile in range from distance of 70 miles. But elevation finding was notoriously poor and bearing could be off as much as 12 degrees. In broad daylight, eagle-eyed aviators could make up the difference, but night fighters needed to be steered to within roughly 1,000 feet of their quarry before pilots could see well enough to carry out an attack. Lording over a staff of one himself, the Welshman formed the country's first airborne radar group. The odds didn't look good. The Orphaness transmitter alone took up a full room and weighed several tons. Receiver equipment filled another small hut. A practical airborne radar, on the other hand, could take up only about 8 cubic feet and weigh no more than 200 pounds. The meager 500-watt power supply on existing aircraft, already fully occupied serving other systems, highlighted the need for a bigger generator. Given the problems of aerodynamic drag, the antenna must be shrunk to a vertical stub compared to the ground towers, dictating an operating wavelength of close to 1 meter, much shorter than had so far proven feasible. Finally, any airborne radar needed to be so simple that a pilot or special operator could use it during the rush of combat. As the second half of 1936 progressed, Bodsey entered a frustrating period. Unable to move directly to anything close to 1 meter, Bowen settled for building a prototype of a scaled-down Orphaness system on 6.8 meters. Meanwhile, that September, the Manor Group suffered through a failed demonstration before a host of dignitaries that included Sir Hugh Dowding, who by then had taken over Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. Dowding, watching the trial in the receiver room, heard the planes before anything appeared on a radar screen. A few days later, Watson Watt received a harsh letter from Tizard, which he read to a downcast staff. To say that I was disappointed on Thursday is to put it very mildly. As you put it yourself, you have to face the fact that very little progress and achievement has been made for a year. Unless very different results are obtained soon, I shall have to dissuade the Air Ministry from putting up other stations. Watson Watt told his charges only a few months remained to turn things around. The chief problem turned out to rest with the whole new transmitter, which was only partially complete in time for the trial. Launching a push to improve the system, the superintendent himself climbed a tower in a screaming gale to work on the antenna. The radar pioneers quickly recovered. The following April, the Manor Station successfully detected planes 100 miles away. By August, the first official chain home stations looked out to sea from Bodsey, Canewdon, and Dover. Eddie Bowen had temporarily put his one main airport interception project on the back burner to help resurrect the main transmitter. Back at work in the first few months of 1937, he made rapid progress. Working out of a small lab in the Manor's White Tower, he combined a cathode ray tube with a turned tuned radio frequency receiver designed for television into a unit that weighed less than 20 pounds and drew little power. Designing an AI transmitter proved a more difficult hurdle, but by that summer, bolstered by the addition of a few assistants and the acquisition of powerful doorknob transmitting tubes just out from Western Electric, he pieced together a serviceable system on the respectable short wavelength of 1.25 meters. The first test flight of a fully airborne radar took place on August 17, 1937. Bowen took leave to visit his parents in Wales and missed the historic event, to his infinite regret. Gerald Touch and Keith Wood took the radar aloft. It did not locate another plane. Instead, it detected ships a few miles off the Felixstowe coast. The news sparked a transformative in the airborne project, shifting the emphasis from airborne interception to what is called ASV, for air-to-surface vessel radar. Watson Watt quickly volunteered the airborne unit for upcoming air-sea exercises in which Coastal Command aircraft would defend the island against an enemy armada by trying to locate portions of the British fleet sailing from the Strait of Dover into the North Sea. The games were scheduled to begin on Saturday, September 4th, the day before the event. Having just completed a final checkout of his airborne radar set, Bowen sipped a beer in the sergeant's mess at Martlesham Heath, airfield with Wood and Sergeants Kenneth Edward Nash. The threesome were still on the first round, musing about the upcoming exercise, when the aviator predicted the Naval Task Force would be charting a course up the English Channel at that very moment. As Wood and Bowen digested this tidbit, Nash added, "Let's go down and take a look." It sounded like a good way to glean some vital intelligence on the fleet's whereabouts for the next day. The men downed their beers and piled into an ensign put on their disposal. Nash found the fleet without trouble. The battleship Rodney, carrier Courageous, and cruiser Southampton, attended by 6 destroyers, had not yet made it out of the channel. The radar checked out perfectly. Satisfied it would give a good accounting the next day, the men returned home. As dawn broke the following morning, the trio waited on the flight perimeter for the last wisps of fog to clear. When the trees at one end of the field could be seen, the ensign roared off, crossing the coast at Felixstowe, and heading due east to where its crew calculated the naval force should be. The men spotted 6 flying boats, rivals in the hunt for enemy flotilla, taking off the Felixstowe and heading north of their own position, cruising at 3,000 feet in a square search pattern. Bowen's team noticed nothing but an occasional echo from small boats until 8 o'clock. Suddenly, a large return showed them on the screen at a distance of 5 or 6 miles. As the little plane closed on the blips, the entire task force, with the exception of the Rodney, came into view. Sharp-eyed lookouts must have spotted the solo airplane, for all hell broke loose. Signals light flashed in all directions, guns were fired, no doubt firing blanks, and aircraft started to take off from the Courageous, Bowen remembered. Although the radar group didn't know it at the time, all the carriers, 15 swordfish, took off, their progress flaring across the ensign's radar screen in the world's first air-to-air radar detection. To avoid the slow-flying swarm, Nash brought the plane up to the 9,000 feet and moved off northward to try to find the missing battleship. After more than an hour of fruitless reconnaissance, fuel running low, the 3 decided to give up. The hunt had been so intense that no one had paid much attention to the deteriorating weather or their position. Nash brought the craft down low through a thick haze until a few hundred feet above the sea, the glassy surface showed itself. Maneuvering to just 20 feet over the waves, he tried to divine their location. Finally, someone spotted a large black and white marker designating the Dutch coast, giving the pilot the bearing he needed to turn back toward Martlesham Heath. The squadron leader climbed to a safer height above the weather and brought the ensign down again when the English coastline showed on the radar screen. The tiny craft landed with about 15 minutes fuel to spare. On the ground, Bowen dug out the phone number of an Air Ministry official Watson Watt had asked him to call with the test results. Dutifully, the Welshman reported finding the naval force some 2 hours earlier, naming the vessels and their position. Yes, that is correct. An aircraft did intercept the fleet in that position and at that time. The officer agreed. But what squadron is this reporting? When Bowen replied he did not belong to any squadron, puzzlement turned into astonishment. Not only was the man unaware of the radar group's participation, he told Bowen the foul weather had forced exercise organizers to call back all planes. The significance of this news did not escape Bowen. We had found the fleet under conditions which had ground and coastal command. We had detected the other aircraft for the first time with self-contained airborne radar, and simply by returning home in one piece, had demonstrated some of its navigational capabilities, he once summarized. It had been a banner day for radar. Its star on the rise, Spodsea Manor, came even more under the watchful eye of government and military officials. Since the Air Ministry ran the station, the RAF took an active interest in the radar project. Opening a training and operations school at the manor, its graduates took over the chain's operation. The War Office attached Army scientists and technicians to Bodsea, where they developed mobile gun control and searchlight radars for coastal defense. The Admiralty, too, placed a naval liaison officer at Manor to aid its own separate effort to install radar on ships. Both service arms once contented to study radio communications, gunnery, and sonar. Also set up RDF projects at their own research establishments. As radar became incorporated into the mainstream of military life, the firebrand days slipped away and the manor gradually took on a more formal character. The transition to officialdom was cemented in late 1937 when Watson Watt climbed a bit closer to the inner circle by stepping up to Director of Communications Development at the Air Ministry. A.P. Rowe, the prickly Tizard Committee Secretary, took over as Bodsea's superintendent. Rowe's officious manner did not endear him to the freewheeling staff, who pretended Watson Watt's scoutish familiarity. Hanbury Brown enraged the incoming administrator by shooting a rabbit from the window of a White Tower lab. The young recruit claimed to need the meat to supplement his 214-pound annual salary. Hearing the shotgun blast, Rose rushed in to the point out a station order prohibiting killing game on the grounds. Rabbits, countered Brown with contempt, are not game, they are vermin. Rowe forced the men to sign in and out and issued a stream of infamous station orders that further disenfranchised the Bodsea's workers. The first called for the standard of living and general conduct to conform to what is expected of professional civil servants. Another instructed the men to save razor blades by sharpening them on glass. Still, a somewhat begrudging respect formed between the two sides. The superintendent gave his charges credit for bringing a fresh outlook, even genius, to the enterprise. And despite Rowe's adverse effect on overall cohesion, he took a broad view of the Broadsea's work's importance that was not lost on his staff. Partly because of Rowe and partly in spite of him, the station continued to flourish. The Army group worked so quickly that by the end of 1938, the government approved orders for 1,000 anti-aircraft gun and searchlight radars and 40 coastal defense sets designed to peer over the water and provide gun batteries with the range and bearing data needed to engage enemy ships. The all-important chain home outpost also thrived. The 5 originally contracted stations went on 24-hour alert in time for the Munich Crisis of September 1938. Operators followed Neville Chamberlain's aircraft for 100 miles as the Prime Minister winged off to meet with Hitler and thrash out a way for the Reich to seize control of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland. As the international situation worsened, the government pressed ahead with plans to establish a 20-station network up and down the east and south coasts, and Bodsey switched to 7-day work weeks on Good Friday, 1939. Stations stretched from the Isle of Wight in the English Channel to the Firth of Tay, halfway up Scotland. The gritty island nation was drawing a line in the ether. Parallel with the chain-home development, Bowen's small airborne radar band struggled to resolve its remaining technical hang-ups. Planes carried no oxygen for the crew. Testing equipment as high up as 19,000 feet, the men sometimes returned with splitting headaches, and a few showed signs of disorientation. Still, by the spring of 1939, the team had cleared several important hurdles. The rise of the twin-engined aircraft meant planes carried an extra drive shaft. Bowen's contingent seized on the fact, installing an engine-driven alternator that cranked out an additional 800 watts and solved on the onboard power problem. The ASB antenna configuration was also refined, though it would be upgraded several more times. The exact setup depended on the plane. However, in one popular scheme, a Yagi transmitting aerial was fitted to the nose, with receiving aerials on either side. A second transmitting array crowned the midsection, with 2 other receiving antennas looking port and starboard. Planes relied on these eyes for maximum coverage while in the search mode. Upon detecting a ship, the pilot banked towards the signal and switched to the forward-looking system, in which overlapping lobes fanned down ahead of the plane. By balancing the return from these 2 lobes, he could home in on a target. A steady stream of dignitaries, including all of the top Royal Air Force commanders, trooped to Bodsey for a demonstration on the heels of the strong showing in the 1937 air-sea exercises. The original priority for an airborne interception radar waned in favor of air-to-surface vessel ASV systems. After the Munich Crisis, when the reality of impending war heightened the threat of air attacks, the focus shifted back to AI. Fighter Command's top officer, Hugh Dowding, showed up to view the system one morning in mid-June 1939. He and Bowen climbed into the back of a ferry battle. Without seatbelts, the 2 sat side by side on a plank of wood, their heads tucked under the black cloth that shielded the cathode ray screens. Thinking of night fighting difficulties, Dowding showed particular interest in the minimum range feature, how close the AI could steer an interceptor to an enemy plane before the echo was lost in the clutter of the radar pulse. The air marshal asked to be notified when the goal had been reached so that he could see for himself their relation to the target. As Bowen relates it, when the pilot finally gave the cue, Dowding looked around. "Where is it? I can't see it." The radar man pointed straight up. The battle flew almost underneath the other plane. "My God," ordered Dowding, "tell him to move away. We are too close." A few days later, Winston Churchill arrived to make his own assessments. Although not part of the government, the formidable statesman strove to rally the nation with his constant calls for rearmament and stood in line for a top post if war broke out. Unlike the fighter command leader, Churchill stayed on the ground for his demonstration. In ceremonious fashion, he removed his black Homburg and handed a partially smoked cigar to the Martlesham commanding officer. Replacing the hat with a foraged cap, borrowed from an onlooking airman, the visitor squeezed his portly frame into the battle, equipped for the memorable occasion with wooden stairs to facilitate boarding. As the target plane droned around the airfield, Hanbury Brown treated the eminent guest to a successful demonstration of airborne radar on the ground. Afterwards, Churchill emerged from the plane, reclaimed the cigar and hat, and retired to the officers' mess. Tea had been arranged, and as the statesman sat down, someone asked him how he would like his served. Tea, tea, the visitor proclaimed. Fetch me a brandy, a big one. On August 1, 1939, probably as directed consequence of Dowding's test flight, Bowen's group received a crash order for 30 sets to be installed in Blenheim. Night fighters within a month, the small crew could not possibly meet the deadline. But as the summer came to an end, an ominous tension rose in the world that heightened the urgency surrounding their task. Over the past 18 months, with barely a whimper of international opposition, Hitler had fortified the swelling Third Reich with annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia. The previous April, Italian forces had seized tiny Albania, a perfect springboard for assaults on Greece and Yugoslavia. Finally, in the waning days of August, the Soviet news agency TASS stunned the West by announcing the imminent conclusion of a non-aggression pact between Germany and the USSR. At Bawdsey Manor, Eddie Bowen and his compatriots daily passed by the watchwords carved in French in the arched stone entrance. Plutôt mourir que changer. Better to die than change. The message harkened back to another time. Around them, as the world seethed, the radar men could not afford to play a waiting game.